All right, we are live. Um, Good evening, everyone who is joining us. My name is Kenny Francis. I am the Vice President of Indivisible New Orleans. If you're joining us tonight, thank you for joining. We're having a series of conversations as we prepare for the fall school board elections. So just as a reminder, if you don't know, this fall, on top of electing a new president, on top of electing a new district attorney in New Orleans, we'll also be voting for all 7 slots on the Orleans Parish School Board. And we're planning on having some forums with those candidates later on this month. But what I wanted to do and what we wanted to do as an organization is to help grow people's knowledge about some of the issues that they should be thinking about for the school board race. And so what we're having this week is a series of 3 conversations with some subject matter experts, one of which I have with me here right now, to talk about issues that you should be thinking about as you think about what you want to see from your school board members, whether they be the incumbents or the folks running against them. So tonight we'll be with my good friend and colleague, Neva, who's going to be talking to us about how schools are funded. Because like a lot of things, we like to do things a little bit more complicated in Louisiana and specifically in New Orleans. So school funding is actually more complicated than you think it is. And I'm actually really looking forward to tonight's conversation because I'm going to be learning a ton myself, because even having been in and around schools and education in the state for almost 10 years now, I barely understand how our school funding works. So I'm really excited to learn from Neva. She's really a great expert on this. Tomorrow, we're going to have Amy Grainer, who's going to explain how One App works. So for all you parents out there wondering how that works and how the algorithm works and what sort of the way the system is set up, I would recommend you tune in for that one. And then our last conversation is going to be with Angel Delarge, who's going to explain to us how charter school management and oversight works, because our school district is unique and doesn't operate like most of the districts in the country, if not any other district in the country. And so there's some like really specific things to the way that schools are run in New Orleans that as you think about the types of things that you want to see from your school board members, you should know. And so with that, I'm going to jump right into introducing our guest. Our guest is Neva Butkus. She is the policy analyst for the Louisiana Budget Project, which is a really great nonprofit that does a lot of really amazing work in Louisiana, specifically around doing studies around economic disparities, looking at our tax code. And Neva is their in-house expert, and I've learned a lot from her in our time of knowing each other, and I'm excited to learn more tonight. Thanks for joining us, Neva.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. I don't think I've ever presented on the MFP or school finance virtually before, so I am nervous and I'm excited and I'm ready to dig into it. So thank you all for anyone who's watching. Again, my name's Neva Butkus. I'm an analyst at the Louisiana Budget Project, policy analyst, and I focus predominantly on K-12 finance policy as well as kind of general tax policy, corporate and individual, which seem very different, but they overlap quite a bit. So I've been in Louisiana for 12 years. My mom's family's from here, but I actually many people have become very much acquainted with my hometown recently. I grew up about 3 miles south of Kenosha, Wisconsin. So been in the news a lot, and but yeah, been here a long time, and I like Louisiana, but yeah, we can go ahead and dig in. Kenny, if you want to pull up the slide.
Yeah, and so in a second, I'm going to pull up these slides that Neva's going to be sharing with us. Before we get to that, I just want to remind folks that if you have a question for Neva, you can ask it by going to Slido, that's SLIDO.com. And then when it pops up, it's going to ask you for the event code, and the code is school funding, just all one word. And you put your questions in there. I will see them and I will ask them when we have time after Neva's presentation. One of the things I love about using Slido is that it operates a little bit like a social media site would. So if you go on there and you see a question that somebody has already written that you like, you can literally just like it. And then the questions with the most likes will pop to the top. And so it will let me as the moderator know what questions folks are most interested in hearing the answers to with the time that we have. So one more time, if you have questions, you can go to Slido, SLIDO.com, type in the event code school funding, and I will see them. With that, let's pull up our slides. I love that you came prepared with a slide presentation. For those of you that don't know Neva, this is very awkward.
You can't talk about the MFP without like visuals. It's
So if you were tuning in not expecting to have a class, welcome to class. Make sure you You have your number 2 pencil and ready to go. So yeah, let's start here at the top. I'm gonna let you take over here, Neva.
Yeah, of course. Could you go into presentation mode, and then it'll be a little bit bigger, I think, on my end then.
Yes, let's see if I can. Just 1 second, y'all.
If not, I'm sure I can make do.
Does that make it better? Nope, it did not. No, it's not. It doesn't make it any bigger than this.
Yeah, no problem at all. All right, guys. So we're going to talk about policy challenges in K-12 education in Louisiana, specifically around school funding, but we're going to touch on a few other topics. All I think are related back to funding today. So we can keep moving. Next slide. All right. So just a quick agenda. We're going to talk about the MFP. We're going to talk about school funding in New Orleans because it's a little bit different than other districts. We're going to talk about some of the issues regarding the state of our schools, and then I'm going to tell you how I think we can fix it. All right. So first things first, we're going to talk about the minimum foundation program. This is a term, if you're in policy advocacy world, you've probably heard. And usually I feel like whenever, somebody talks about the MFP, like the next response is like somebody like audibly groans. Everyone thinks it is this vastly complex formula, and it is. But I think any policy advocate, grassroots organizer, et cetera, can learn about it and can advocate on behalf of their schools, parents, PTA. And I think it's really important to know the basics of the formula because it's the bedrock of how we finance our public education system in this state, and it's very important. So I'll move next. All right, so we're gonna do a little school funding 101. First of all, so schools in Louisiana, like most other states, are funded through a combination of different taxes, your local tax dollars, like your property taxes and some sales taxes. Federal dollars come in as well. They pay for things like school nutrition programs in our schools, Title I funds, which go to help and assist low-income districts and schools and students. IDEA funds, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that's actually going to be a little bit more important as we dive into the New Orleans school funding. So keep that in mind. Title II funds from the federal government pay for teacher professional development, and there's some other pots of money too. But today we're going to mostly talk about the state dollar portion of it. So most of the state money for public schools in Louisiana comes from our state general fund, which is where your income taxes go and your state sales taxes go when we pay them. And a little bit of Louisiana lottery money is in there as well. Some of that money gets pushed over to schools. So we've got those kind of pots of money. For the state general fund portion of it, the $3.8 billion that the state pays for our public schools is distributed through a formula called the minimum foundation program to determine how much of that pot of money goes to each district based on need and the number of students and some other factors. And this formula determines, how much each public district gets, but also how much each juvenile detention facility gets, how much each charter school gets, and how much each lab school gets as well. U-High at LSU and Southern Lab at Southern University in Baton Rouge both have lab schools that receive MFP funding as well. So next slide. Okay, so quick MFP 101. It's kind of broken down into 4 levels, and some of them are much larger than the others. So just to make it really, really simple, we're going to think of level 1 as the base of the formula. Level 2 is like the rewards part of the formula. Level 3 is kind of the teachers, personnel part of the formula. And level 4, I call it the lagniappe. I'm assuming most of you are from Louisiana, or you've lived in Louisiana, New Orleans long enough to know what that means. And if you don't, it's just like a little something extra. So these 4 levels combined, as I mentioned, cost the state $3.8 billion this year. It's the largest single expenditure from the state general fund. It costs more than healthcare from the state general fund. Healthcare overall costs more when you factor in federal dollars, but from our state tax dollars, the MFP is the single largest expenditure.
Neva, I'm going to jump in because I can take the privilege of being the moderator and interrupt you. Just a point of clarification there. So to go back to the previous slide, that talks about MFP and the way it's funded. Just to clarify what you just explained about the 4 different levels of MFP, you're talking specifically about the local dollars or the state general fund and the Louisiana lottery dollars?
So level 1 and level 2 are kind of a combination of state and local tax dollars, which we're going to get into in a second. And then levels 3 and level 4 are predominantly state funded programs.
Okay, and I'm assuming the lagniappe is the lottery money, since we can't really depend on that.
No, some of the lottery money, I believe, actually gets as it moved into as an interagency transfer into the state general fund, and then is distributed through
the formula.
Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to talk about level 1 at first of the MFP. This is the most important part. Level 1 is the base part of the formula, and it drives the equity and adequacy for the rest of the formula. So if you understand, if you remember anything from this, presentation, this is the most important part by far. So almost every state has a funding formula for their schools, and almost every funding formula starts with kind of a base amount. Basically, it's the minimum amount that you can spend per student, hence the minimum foundation program. The base amount, when the formula was originally created in the 90s, I think, the base amount was originally intended to basically cover all of the basic costs to educate a student, your average student. That's not really the case anymore, but we're going to go into that in a second as well. From the formula's inception to about 2008, that base amount, which right now is $4,015 per student, per pupil, used to increase by 2.75% every single year. It was mandated in Louisiana. After Katrina, our state was flush with cash. And right before the housing market crash of 2008, we decided to cut taxes in Louisiana. And since... So our former governor, since he was not a fan of raising taxes and made quite a few promises never to do so, they decided to stagnate the formula as opposed to let it continue to increase each year. Since then, since 2008, the formula has increased 2 times when it used to increase every single year, which is, has unsurprisingly taken a huge hit on our districts, especially districts that don't have a large local tax base to tap into to make up some of those funds. But we're also going to go into that in a little bit too. So like I said, the formula right now, it's $4,015 per student. That is the minimum amount we can spend per student. And that amount is shared by the local and state governments. And that's a really complex part of the formula to determine that. We'll go into that a little bit in a second too. But I think the important part to take away from this graph that you can see on your screen, and just in case it's a little small for some of you, I will break it down a little bit. So the top line that's going straight up is what we would be spending each school year had the 2.75% continued to the 2020-2021 school year. The middle line, the purple line, is what we actually spend today. So the very end of that line is $4,015. And then the green line that's at the bottom is showing the depreciation based on inflation of the actual amount that we spend today. So, we spend $4,015, but if we're talking about depreciation since 2007, we spend about $800 less than we did in 2007. So, and if the formula had increased as intended, if we never cut it in 2008 and it continued to increase by 2.75%, as it was always intended to do, we would be spending almost $1,500 per student this year. And if that doesn't sound like a lot of money to you, an elementary school of 500 students, an additional $1,500 per student is an additional $735,000 a year. I can't think of anything we could do with that money.
There's a lot you could do with the original $700,000.
That
per school
would be shared a little bit between the local and state parts. But the locals are, at this point contributing more than their fair share, which is kind of the problem. But first, we're going to talk about the weights too. So the formula, we've got that base amount, that $4,015 per student. But we know that some students have different needs than others, and we have weights in the formula to kind of factor that in. So if you want to go to the next slide, we'll walk into that a little bit.
And just to give, before we keep going there, Neva, just to give some folks who, if you're watching this, whether you're watching it live, or I know a lot of people said they're going to watch the recording of this, if you're watching this back, $700,000 per school additional funding is a ton of money. Like, even as we're sitting here, I'm usually pretty good at this. I'm like struggling to think about how to spend that money on the top of my head. One of the things, and I think just to give you guys some scale, you could easily give a bunch of teacher raises. Like, you could, I think just doing the math on that. Let's say you had, hypothetically speaking, you had a school of 50 teachers and you wanted to give them each an additional $10,000. You'd still have $200,000 left over. So imagine that we could raise teacher salaries by 10 grand, just like off the top, if we could, flip a switch and have that extra $1,500 per kid right now, and you would still have $200,000 a year to spend on other services. So you think about the things that like schools are struggling to afford right now, things like higher teacher salaries, things like better benefits packages that will help retain teachers, things like buying computers for every kid right now, which a lot of schools are really struggling to be able to pay for. Things like getting that second or third social worker that we know every single school needs. Things like making that nurse that is part-time actually a full-time nurse, because schools should have a full-time nurse. Things like that, like the things that we could do if every school had an extra $700,000 each school. So yeah, it's a lot of money that we have left on the table.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so the weights are a very important part about the base per pupil spending. As I mentioned, every student is different, and Louisiana actually has one of the more equitable formulas of the states. I love saying that because, I feel like we talk about a lot of bad things in Louisiana, and it is great to say that, we're probably in the top 10, 15% of formulas across the country. Ours is quite equitable. Adequate is a different conversation, but it is quite equitable. So as you can see, there are a couple different weights that factor into how much we spend per pupil on top of that base. So you've got your economically disadvantaged weight, which I believe now they calculate that using a more of like a hybrid method that takes account into not just income, but students who are, if you're on SHIP, that you get grouped into that. If your family receives SNAP or free and reduced lunch, you get looped into that. So it's a little bit more comprehensive. One thing that a lot of people don't know is we also have an English second learner weight that is grouped into that economically disadvantaged weight, but you can't get both. So, my husband was a Russian immigrant. He moved to Baton Rouge when he was 8. His dad was teaching at LSU. They were all living off a teacher assistant salary for a family of 4, and they wouldn't be able to tap into that 22% weight twice as kids who did not speak English, but were also low income in Baton Rouge public schools. I would love to break out those two weights. Those students deserve, as Kenny talked about, we need more nurses, we need more schools. We also need more ESL teachers in many districts that are highly trained, and that money could go towards that. So we've got career and technical education weights. That's basically just Jumpstart, if you're familiar with that. Special education weights at 150%, which is the largest one. Students who are in gifted or talented programs get a 60% weight on top of that, $4,015. And then economy of scale weights can range up to 20%. And basically that is just for districts that have students under 7,500 pupils. Because, even when you're a really small rural district, you still have to pay for like busing and administrators and paraprofessionals, and that takes up such a larger part of your budget when you have less students in general. And so they give them a little bit of a boost to help them afford the things that every school district needs, even though they have less students. So that's kind of the breakdown of the weights, and I'm going to walk you through an example now on the next slide.
Can I ask a point of clarification here, Neva?
Of course.
So just to clarify, you said for the economically disadvantaged weight and for the English language learners weight, you can get one but not both of those?
Yes. Yep.
And so would it be safe to say that in a city like New Orleans, where we have some of the highest levels of child poverty in the country, including also the state, and also a growing ELL population, that this sort of explains why a lot of schools struggle to sort of provide services specifically for students that qualify for ELL services? Because I know that that's a growing and necessary conversation we're having in our schools, is that as the percentage of students who qualify for those services and that need those services continues to increase every year, our schools are really struggling to keep up. And I think any parent with a child that speaks English as a second language who's trying to find a school that is servicing their kids at a quality level can tell you that. And our voice, Nuestra Voz, can tell you a lot about this specific issue. And so, essentially, how would they change that? Is that something that the city can decide, or that had to be a state level action to separate those?
So to separate at the MFP level would be a state level action. Just to give everyone like a quick overview of how the formula is passed, I guess, each year. So the BESI, our state school board, is responsible for developing the formula each year based on the recommendations of an MFP task force and other stakeholders. They then present the formula to House and Senate Education. The legislature can basically give like an up or down vote. They cannot change the formula within the legislature. They can give recommendations and send it back, and then BESI might adjust it just because they want to get it passed. But so BESI could develop a formula that breaks out those two weights and move it through the legislature. But it's a continuing, ongoing conversation. There are many schools in certain neighborhoods in Baton Rouge, which is where I am at as well, where we're seeing larger percentages of students who English is their second language and they need additional supports, and they deserve those supports. And while the MFP is a block grant, I think that's important to recognize too. The money comes in as one block. So if we split out those weights, that doesn't necessarily mean that each district's going to go hire another ESL teacher. Unfortunately, they can use the money essentially for any personnel or learning, teaching type activities. Basically, almost anything except for like construction. That's like the big no-no with the MFP. That's why you see local penny referendums and stuff, like penny sales tax to build schools in your districts. So yeah, but I mean, splitting those out would allow for districts that have larger percentages of English language learner students to get a little bit of extra boost if they're also low income. And if this district sees that as a priority, or the school board sees it a priority, that can go to another teacher that is to the students. So, yep.
Thank you for that. Two things. One, here's where I'm going to insert myself here as the advocate and say, so the reason why we're having this conversation is so that folks can be more educated on this stuff as they think through how they're going to vote in November for their school board members. So while our local school board would not have domain over being able to make this split out happen for economically disadvantaged students as well as for English language learners, I believe that it is the part of the job description of being a school board member is to advocate for your community. And so I think a great question for folks to ask potential board members and incumbents who are running for re-election is, what are you going to do about the fact that we have a population that we're serving that has high numbers of poverty, and we have a growing ELL population, and we're struggling as a district to support both of them? How are you going to use your position as a board member to advocate for more resources for our community? Because we see that we have a high need in both these communities. And from what you're explaining to us very well, Neva, is that essentially we're only getting money for one of them and probably not enough.
Mm-hmm. You will be pleasantly surprised on this topic by the New Orleans formula that we're going to dive into a little bit later. But at the state level, yeah, there's nothing to accommodate somebody who is both low income and is ELL.
And so the second thing I'm going to ask you here is, because I got a specific question on this slide. So instead of waiting to the end, I'm just going to ask you now. The question is, for the economies of scale weights, since most of our New Orleans charters are small LEAs, so for those who don't know the lingo, LEA stands for Local Education Agency. Can we assume that most of our LEA charters are getting the benefit of this weight, or does this not carry over to New Orleans differentiated funding?
I would have to check into that a little bit. It might depend on who chartered them. So if it is somebody, if they are an LEA, but technically they are under like OPSB, that's probably a no. But if you're a small charter that's been chartered by the state or something, I could very quickly look that up though.
Just to even clarify there, because I'm going to try to explain this to folks who aren't as enmeshed in the policy as we are.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that it will depend on whether or not the charter is in the LEA for OPSB, or in an independent LEA, or it depends if whether they were a type 2 chartered by the state or a type 3 that is locally authorized?
So I actually just pulled up the budget letter, and the way the formula works is that it basically hits the block grant is kind of calculated based on the district as a whole, or like the district boundaries as a whole. And like type 2 charter schools, RSD, and then type 5, which is RSD, right? So those schools are already looped into that formula. So if the charter school is in a district that overall has the population under 7,500, then they would be included in that. But if that is not the case, I don't believe, like that. I can definitely go back and check based on like state chartered entities and whether or not the economy of scale weight does apply to them, since they are smaller and they're not necessarily like attached to like East Baton Rouge Parish.
Okay. So just to clarify, the answer,
Mm-hmm.
I believe, to that question is pretty much all of our charters in New Orleans aren't getting the economy of scale weight, because most of them are authorized by the local district.
Yep. That is correct.
Got it.
Yep.
And then there may be a few individual examples of folks who qualify, but generally speaking,
there's a charter school in Avoyles Parish. I'm not sure what they're chartered from. But yeah, that's a really great question.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna let you get to the next slide.
Okay. So we're going to do a quick walkthrough of like how you would calculate level 1 funding for a district. I've got the hypothetical school district X. We're going to pretend it has 1,000 students. And remember, we need to spend a minimum of $4,015 per student. So we're going to pretend this district has 500 students who are economically disadvantaged or English language learners. They can't double it up. 100 students have disabilities, and then 200 students are considered gifted. So basically, to calculate what we call like the weighted student enrollment, you're going to take how many students qualify under that category and then times it by the weight. So for the 500 economically disadvantaged students, you're going to take 500 times 0.22, a 22% weight, and you're going to get 110. So after you calculate all of those like additional weights, you tack them onto the initial student enrollment of 1,000 students. You can see kind of in the middle, I've got 1,000 plus 110, which is the economically disadvantaged weight, 150, which is the students with disabilities weight, and 120, which is the students that are gifted weight. That's going to give you a weighted student enrollment of 1,380 students. So that's basically the number of students they say you need to have a base for. So then you take that and then times it by the base amount of 4,015. And that's what's going to tell you essentially how much money that district needs to function based on the individual characteristics of the students that attend that school. So for this specific example, we allegedly need about $5.5 million to fund school district X. That cost is then shared between so we know how much it costs, right? We know it's 5.5 million now. The state says, okay, so that's how much we need. How much should the locals pay and how much should the state pay now? And based on that local district's ability to raise revenue, what their industry, what their tax base looks like. And also, like, if they're trying, there's a part of the formula to determine that is like, do you have a lot of money, but you're not tapping into it? So they look at all those factors and they essentially determine like, okay, like The state will cough up 60% of it, and the locals can pay for 40% of that 5.5 million. And you can see I have the breakdown of like what they would hypothetically pay 2.2 million for the locals, 3.3 million for the state. So the maximum amount of money that a state currently contributes to a district is 89%. I'm assuming that's one of the districts in the Delta parishes. They tend to have to help them out a lot since there isn't much tax revenue for them to tap into. And the minimum that they will fund is 25%. So every district, regardless of wealth, the state will cover at least 25% of their level 1 costs. So that's kind of how that is how level 1 works. If you understood that, you already understand 1/4 of the MFP. So congratulations. But a question I get then is, what happens if the locals raise more than they need to, right? So in this scenario, the locals need to raise $2.2 million, their sales tax and their property taxes. What happens if they raise $4 million? Where does it go? And I can answer that question next, unless Kenny got anything for me on this slide.
Unless you're going to cover it, what happens if the locals don't raise enough money?
The state kind of they basically just work with them, but that's not a very common occurrence. I was looking through this year's budget letter, and Plaquemines Parish last year missed it by a little bit. But every single district pretty much for 10 years has met and exceeded their obligation.
And the obligation is decided just by a formula the state creates based off of expected tax revenue?
Yep. Gotcha. Well, so the state has to contribute an average of 65%. That's in the MFP. So basically, it's a sliding scale for each district to determine how much they want to contribute. So it's 25% here, 80% for this district, and when it's all said and done, it has to add up to 65%. So that's kind of where they base it off of.
Okay, and I guess my question, the reason why I'm asking that line of thinking is coming from is, given what COVID has done to our state and local economies, particularly a place like New Orleans, where I'm going to hazard a guess just by understanding the way the money typically works in the state, that New Orleans is one of the districts that is able to afford a larger share than some of our more rural, smaller districts around the state. But given that our economy has been utterly decimated by COVID, I imagine that's going to change the game a little bit in terms of like how much we can pay. And I guess the question is like, will the state account for that and like make up the difference?
Yeah, that's going to depend on relief package, the impending relief package. Fingers crossed.
Okay. Not feeling great about that. Okay. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna let you get to the next one. I have 1,000 questions, but I'm gonna let you get to some of these slides.
All right, so if the state if that district raises too much money, it gets counted in level 2. Remember I said like level 2 was like kind of considered the rewards program. So actually I have the numbers for Orleans Parish. I pulled it up, figured I know the crowd. Orleans Parish was obligated to $131.8 million for their local obligation this year for their like level 1 base. Like that's how much. I think it was about 50-50, I think, this year between Orleans Parish and the state in terms of their total level 1 costs. They decided to split it 50-50. But Orleans Parish didn't raise $131.8 million. They raised $324 million. So whatever is left over then gets kind of counted into the level 2 portion of the formula, which has become problematic in recent years, in my professional opinion. Maybe some people would disagree with me, but what's happened is as the base amount in level 1 hasn't increased, we know that base is no longer adequate to fund our schools. We know it's not. We can't live off $4,015 per student. That would be literally impossible for our school districts to survive off of. So what's happened in recent years, with the question you just asked about, what happens if a district doesn't make the cut? they pretty much have all been making the cut and then some, even our poorest districts, which I think is a testament to the fact that it is inadequate. They're raising way more money at the local level. The cost share, when you start adding in the other levels of the MFP, not just level one, you're seeing the locals start to take on a little bit more of the burden of funding our schools. I don't like you to use the word burden because it's not a burden. We're here to fund our school, but yeah, it is what it is. So you'll see in this graph, and it's a few years old. It's from a report I did 2-3 years ago. And basically the top line is showing the total amount that locals have been contributing into level 2. So the total amount that locals have been giving on top of their level 1 obligation. And to add to the problem, what happens since, level 2 was initially supposed to be like a rewards program, basically what they did when the formula was created was they said like, oh, if a district raises a lot of money and it's more than we say they need, they're obviously prioritizing education. So we're going to give them a little extra. We're going to match some of it. So that match still exists. But, for a district like Tensaw or Union Parish, they are meeting their obligation, but they're not blowing it out of the water. And then, New Orleans raised almost $200 million more than they said they needed to. So it starts tipping the scales and making the formula less equitable because of how that matching works, as opposed to counting more of that money back into level 1 of the formula where it's calculated to be a little bit more equitable. This is a really complex part of the formula. So I can break down any other parts of it. But the key parts to kind of know are just, every state is raising, or every local district is pretty much raising more money than the state says they need. And a lot of it's being counted into level 2 of the actual formula. Let's see, I'll check my notes, make sure I didn't actually miss any important. Oh yeah, no, I got it all.
All right.
The initial question.
There's a couple questions, but I think those are better for the end because it's about specific things that I think you're probably going to cover.
Sounds good. All right, we're going to wrap up this formula with level 3 and 4. So this part's so short, I can fit in one slide. Level 3 funds, the teacher part, they're kind of special requests from the legislature, but most of them have to do with like the state teacher pay raises from last year. They live in level 3, that $1,000 across the board and $500 for support workers. Those live in level 3. There's some hold harmless dollars to balance out changes from the past, to kind of like phase, not to shock a district, to phase certain aspects of the formula out. And then they've got like some dollars that are allocated to assist with increases in health insurance and retirement benefits. Not a ton of money, but they've got some in there. Level 4, the lagniappe, it pays for a lot of kind of random things, which is why I call it that. So it helps kind of like underwrite foreign language teachers in certain districts. It has additional money for certain IEPs. We have the students with disabilities weight on the front end of the formula. Certain students with very particular disabilities, they can also tap into other money based on their IEP in this level of the formula. They give you a little extra money for secondary education because high school can cost more. And then there's more career and technical training dollars in the level 4 as well. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of, of programs. But that is all 4 levels of the formula right there, y'all. So the last thing on the school finance part that I want to talk about, or at least this part of the school and finance part, is to just combat, 2 years ago, whenever we were talking about teacher pay raises, there's a huge debate over per pupil spending and teacher pay raises. That took up a lot of the legislature's time. And a thing that I kept hearing from some legislators was we already spend like an average amount of money and we're already at the bottom for testing and everything. So like, where's all this money? Where's all this money going to? The truth is we're not spending an average amount of money. We're spending an average amount of money in regards to like, if you lined them up from top to bottom, we're like somewhere in the middle. But I compare it when I present on this to like running a marathon. So like if you let's say you're running a mile with your friends, it's you and 2 other people. Your friend who finishes first runs the mile in 4 minutes. the person that finishes last runs it in 20 minutes and you finish it in 18 minutes. Like, you're technically in the middle, but you're a lot closer to the person at the bottom than you are at the top. And that's kind of how school, per pupil spending works. First of all, a lot of times when legislators are talking about how much we spend per pupil, they're also talking about federal funds looped into that. That doesn't count. We only get that money because we're very poor. And we don't do a lot to fix it. So the federal government gives us a lot of money, much more than other states, per student through Title I dollars. As you'll see in this, the highest states, New York and Vermont, most of them are on the East Coast, spend around $24,000 or more per student. We spend about 12.5. That includes federal dollars, I believe. And then the lowest states, Arizona and Ohio, Idaho, Utah's down there too. They spend around 9-10 grand. So a lot closer to the bottom than the top. Don't let legislators tell you we're not spending enough money on schools. We're not spending enough money on a lot of things.
I want to make like 2 points here. One, a point I heard you make a while ago now. I think it was actually the original presentation I saw you gave that made me want to do something like this with you, Neva, is that like 2 things with that. One, like you said, don't let legislators tell you that we spend enough money on schools, because a lot of the money, if not most of the money, is coming from federal dollars. I would make that, I'm going to take that further and make that a blanket statement about Louisiana. If we're talking about a social service of any kind, and you have a state legislator saying that, oh, we spend this amount of it on it, and that's enough, the answer is probably no, because the majority of that money is definitely coming from the feds. A thing that we see in states like Louisiana is that we rail against the federal government. We rail against the tyranny of our national government. Meanwhile, the national government is largely paying our bills most of the time. If we got the sort of like bootstrap mentality, economy, and funding structure that some people in the state claim to believe in, our state would really, really struggle to provide basic services for a lot of people in the state. And so that's one point that I think I just want to underline there, is that like we are a state that depends heavily on our federal dollars. And so whenever we talk about how much money we're spending on something, a good question to always ask is like, how much of that did we get in money from the federal government, and how much are we actually spending? The other thing I wanted to point out here is I would love to see a pullout of, when you look at just the state spending, forget about the federal part, like where do we rank compared to other states of what we spend? Because I know that just from things I've looked at in the past, that even when we talk about states like New York and Vermont, they're spending a much higher amount than we are, just if you just look at just the state contributions. And so whenever you hear conversations, if you're listening to this, you're like are really trying to dive into like budget things. Whenever you hear conversations about how much we're spending on something as a state or even as a city, like really start to ask like, well, how much of that are we spending our money, not money we're getting from the feds, that is like taxes from the whole country. How much are we spending locally? And then you're going to see really what like we can afford. Because the reality of it is that faucet can be turned off or slowed down at any time. My specialty is in early childhood education. And I know I could do a presentation like this on how we fund ECE. And like we talk about a lot of things about how a lot of the progress that we've made. And the reality is overwhelmingly, at least 90% of the funding we spend on early childhood comes from federal programs. So if those programs went away, if Head Start got cut in any way, if early Head Start got cut in any way, most people, I mean, we love to talk about how well we've done with pre-K 4 in this state, and we have done a great job of expanding access, but most people don't know that we fund that with TANF dollars almost completely. So if we all of a sudden got less TANF money, we'd be right back at square one when it came to pre-K. I think that's a really, really, really great point, and I'm glad that you left it in here. I want to ask a specific question that got put in here. The person says it's really in the weeds, but I'm glad that they asked it because I had the same question. So I'm right there with you, person who's in the weeds. Says this is really in the weeds, but does the state's high cost services fund partially via MFP come out of level 4?
High cost services, is that the IEP part potentially?
Yeah, and so I'm gonna try to explain, because I remember looking this up a couple years ago when I was working at the district. My understanding, just off the top of my head, so if anyone's out there as a SPED expert, please don't quote me on this or like make fun of me for getting it wrong if I get it wrong. My understanding of the high cost services fund is let's say you get your MFP allocation that's weighted based upon the number of students you have with exceptionalities in your school. And then there's a tiered system based upon how high the need of the service is. And the more severe the services, or the more involved the services need, the more expensive they are, you get more money for that. But then there's a level in which the MFP calculations cuts off where it's not funded. And so part of what the state did to try to deal with this is they created a thing called the high cost services need fund, where I'm thinking about like, a child that needs individualized transportation, where you need like a special bus just for this one child that probably will have to have like a full-time attendant on it. The child probably also has a full-time one-on-one paraprofessional. Like that gets really expensive really fast, and your MFP weights are not going to cover that. And so the state has a fund that covers some, because a thing that I know is that I know that the high cost services need fund doesn't have enough in it, and it still doesn't end up covering all the costs, but it covers some of that additional cost that's not covered by the MFP weight. And so to try to put like real numbers to that, from what you just explained on the slide, you're going to get $12,500 per pupil. That's for a general education pupil. That's not a pupil with an IEP. For the people in IEP, it's going to be a little bit higher than that. But if that child has an exceptionality that requires $80,000 worth of services, and you're getting $25,000 from your MFP weights, obviously you have a pretty big gap to make up for like one specific kid. There's this fund that the state has that you can get some of that. We know it's not all of that, some of that covered to make up that difference.
I just went back and checked on the budget letter. It is the IEP program I referenced on the previous slide. It is in level 4, and the total pot of money is $12 million.
And that's why it's not all covered, because basically, rather than, it's not funded in a way that's like based on need, it's funded on, here's 12 million, cover as much as you can.
Isn't it an application process? I might be thinking of something else.
I am pretty sure that schools through their special education departments have to like apply to get reimbursed for the cost, but I know that they never get the amount that they need back. So if they ask for whatever, they'll get like half or maybe even less than that. And so here's another point where I would think about, because I think one of the things I really want people to think about as they get ready to vote for school board members is, in a district like ours, that is a unique district in which the day-to-day operations of schools are in the hands of school level actors, the principals, the charter school management organizations. I really want to encourage the public to think about their school board members as advocates for our local community. And these are the types of questions you should be asking your school board member. So we talked previously about having our school board members advocate to get a breakout in the MFP formula for ELL kids and for economically disadvantaged kids. Here's another point where you can have your school board members talk about this, of how are you advocating to make sure that the high cost services fund has enough money in it to actually provide the needs that we're seeing in our community. Because again, most of the time what we see is that when we look at these sort of very expensive things that make it harder to provide quality services for kids, New Orleans, because of the realities of our city, has a higher need. A thing that I know to be true is that we have a higher, what's the word I'm looking for? A higher prevalence of students with high needs in New Orleans than other parts of our state. And so if you have a fund that only has $12 million in it to fund for the whole state, the high cost services for students with IEPs, if it's not enough, guess where that not enough is really going to be felt? Right here in New Orleans. So this is another point, another place where you can, as you consider who you're voting for school board, you can really ask them, like, what are you going to do to advocate for this? What are you going to do to push for us to get more resources for our community that we need? Thank you for explaining that, Neva.
Yeah, great question. I love the intricacies of the formula. So make them in the weeds as you can. I might regret saying that, but Okay, so we're gonna skim through the New Orleans part. It's only a few slides, but we're already at 8:20. It's went by so fast. So, and also if you have more questions about, the intricacies of how New Orleans kind of cycles through their block grant of money, the Cowan Institute and ERA in New Orleans are fantastic resources who just focus on the New Orleans funding part as to where, I'm kind of whole state. So, as you can go ahead and next slide. Okay, so as I'm sure many of you know, RSD was, in New Orleans, but was recently integrated back into the school district 2-ish years ago. And then Orleans Parish is also the only all-charter district in Louisiana and the country. So the MFP, as I mentioned, arrives to all district as a block grant, right? We calculated the amount of money you need. Here you go. Here's, spend it on teachers and schooling and all that good stuff. So New Orleans actually, though, takes that block grant and kind of recycles it again through another formula called differentiated funding. And the reason they need that, earlier we talked about IDEA money from the federal government. And I said it was going to be important when we talked about New Orleans. And this is why. So after Katrina, a lot of people felt that the school reforms left out students with disabilities, as each charter, and this actually goes back to this economies of skill question too. It's all coming full circle, y'all. Each charter school probably had a lot more overhead than a full district because they all were required to provide, multiple services and didn't necessarily have like a central office like East Baton Rouge Parish does. To provide certain services, particularly for students with disabilities. And it was really hard to meet the needs of those students. And I think some of them probably didn't do a very good job of it because they got sued. So in Berry v. Pasterik in 2011, they sued based on this. And what came out of that is a formula called differentiated funding. And if you want to head over to the next slide. This I actually took from the Cowan Institute. So thank y'all if anyone's on there from it. And it shows the kind of different categories different weights from New Orleans schools that they use to determine where they need to allocate funds per school. This was taken from a few years ago. They revamped the formula in 2016, I believe. So you can see what the Orleans Parish School Board formula looked like, the RSD formula looked like, and then the proposed formula, which is what I believe they use now. And it shows you the amount of money that is allocated per student based on those students' needs. One particular point I'll make out too is the different levels for special education tiers. Before the original formula did funding allocation based on students' diagnoses. But what we know is that, in particular, the great example is, a student diagnosed with autism. Two students diagnosed with autism probably don't need the exact same services. My sister's a pediatric occupational therapist. Some of her students, who have autism come to her once a week for work to help with their handwriting. Other students she works with are nonverbal and need, time with her and time with a speech therapist and time with someone to help them with technology and, quite a few other additional services that take up the duration of their day in school. So two diagnoses are not the same. So why would you give those two students the same amount of money based on a formula, which is what the new formula, the new differentiated funding addresses. It addresses more the amount of time a student needs for services and then bases the categories kind of based on that, as opposed to just like a catch-all diagnoses and this is how much money you get regardless of services. So and the reason they did that was because of the lawsuit. They were in violation of IDEA and Act 467, I believe. Oh yeah, I have it on there. Look, I got it right. Act 467 is what they did to comply with all of that. So that is the reason that New Orleans does the differentiated funding to move the money to charter schools based on the needs of students.
I have a question here that's relevant to the slide. So it says, and I think it's more of a clarification question. So it says, so in New Orleans, we get our block MFP calculated like everyone else, and then we do the differentiated funding formula that then determines what each charter school gets. Is that what you?
Yes. I believe particularly now when it was broken out between OPSB and RSE, things were like a lot more complicated. And the federal funding part is much more complicated because each, I think, charter taps into their own federal funding independently. But I believe that now the MFP just hits Orleans Parish as a block grant. And if the schools are technically operated by Orleans Parish School Board, then they are subject to that formula to determine how much money they need.
Gotcha. Another relevant question to this specific is, for New Orleans, is the local authority for these funding decisions OPSB, or does the city council play any role in revenue allocation for the local education dollars outside of the Harris Fund?
I am not entirely sure. If they are, I can tell you that in Baton Rouge, the East Baton Rouge Parish School Board has full authority of MFP funds. The city council and the mayor have little to do, if nothing, with education. I would assume it's the same in New Orleans. I don't know why it would be different, but.
And I'm going to answer that question myself with
Take it away.
I'm going to say 90% certainty. So there's a 10% chance I might be wrong. That the answer to that question is yes. That OPSB, the administration and the board, when it votes on things, is the ones having the local authority that figures out these parish level funding decisions, especially given that that OPSB is its own taxing authority. And so when school taxes come up, it's not the city government asking you to do that. It's the Orleans Parish School Board asking you to do that. It's their own millages that they put forth in front of voters. And the Harris Fund is a separate thing that the city council does control. The Harris Fund is more complicated than I need to explain, but essentially it's a fund that Harris, as it's named for, pays to the city, that the city funds specific programs, specific education programs that they give the money to the district to pay for that. And that money is technically controlled by the city. So for example, the Therapeutic Day Center, the Therapeutic Day program is funded out of the Harris Fund that the city council technically controls. But that is, to my knowledge, the only financial control that the city council or the mayor's office has over what happens with funding in schools.
Thank you. I'm learning stuff too. These are such great questions. Thank you all so much for, these are really thoughtful. So we're in transition away from school finance, and we're going to do like a brief overview of some, I think, really important statistics regarding the state of our school districts, regarding poverty, segregation, and teachers. If you want to go ahead to the next slide, and I'll try to move through this pretty quick. So these are from the 2019 MFP 2019 school year, but the statistics haven't changed much unless we're factoring in changes regarding COVID. So nearly 7 in 10 children in Louisiana's public schools came from economically disadvantaged households in 2019. In many districts like Bogalusa and Tensas, Morehouse, many of our charter schools as well, almost every student is considered economically disadvantaged. And even in our wealthy districts, at least around 40% of students are disadvantaged. We talk about St. Tammany, we talk about Zachary and Central as being like the rich districts in Louisiana. And the thing I always say is it's not a thing. It's not. Like those districts still struggle to pay their bills. They're still kind of rural. I grew up in the North Shore area of Chicago, where some of the median family incomes were, $300,000+. That's a wealthy district. Even if
scale that for folks here in Louisiana, the median family income is about $35,000. So just scale.
So it's no district is wealthy. Even in our wealthy districts, 40% of students. So yeah, I try not to use that term when describing any of our districts. So that's in regards to poverty. On the next slide, I'm going to do a quick overview. I did a piece a few years ago based on some data from ProPublica. They have a really great database on school segregation. I highly recommend you checking into it. And the data they had for 2018 showed that 23 of the 69 traditional school districts, not charters, in Louisiana were under a DSEG order. That was 2018. I also ran some of the numbers, and the higher the segregation of the school district, the worse outcomes seem to be for minority students. They also have data on, suspension, expulsion rates, how likely someone is to be involved in an AP or enrolled in an AP course based on race. And there were, some drastic differences that followed the line of how segregated the school was, whether they were considered highly segregated or moderately segregated, or had very low segregation. I think the only district actually that had very low segregation was West Feliciana, if I'm not mistaken, where St. Francisville is. I also believe that district has no private schools in their city limit or in their parish limits. So maybe a coincidence. Maybe.
Yeah, I'm going to infer that there's some, not coincidence, but I'm going to go further than that, say some correlation there.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that you're not going to say this, but I'm going to say I think that a thing that we should talk about a lot more is that after Brown versus Board of Education, what we saw in Louisiana, and particularly in the New Orleans metro area, was a proliferance of enrollment of white students in parochial schools and private schools that has remained to this day, where we have a public school district that is, I believe, over 80% students of color in the city. And to put it really, really bluntly, after segregation was ended, the white folks decided to send their kids to private school or to Catholic school and never put them back in public school. And that's part of how our schools, and particularly the funding for schools, ended up the way that it has. And so I think that something that I've heard folks say, and I'm really excited to have this conversation tomorrow with Amy when we talk about One App, is I've heard people say things like, I don't want to get all political with like where I send my kids. And it's like, I want to be clear to folks out there that where you choose to send your child for so many reasons is literally the most political decision you make. It really does matter where you send your kid to school, and what part you're playing in your community and what part you're putting them into the community, and the stakes that you have in the community that you're part of. Starting with school funding, but then permeating through so many other things that go into the politics of schools. So, I mean, if at the end of the day, I believe parents, as a parent, you do what you think is best for your kid. But I don't think anyone can get away with saying that, like, well, I don't want to play politics where my kids go to school. It is the most political decision you can make if you have a child. And it definitely matters where you choose to send them. And I think that people should really sit with that. And sit with the fact of where you send your child to school line up with the values that you say out loud that you have to others. And we'll do that more tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean the base amount is $4,015, right? So that's $4,015 where when you send your child to school, you are determining where that money goes in your community. Minimum. So here's another really interesting chart. I believe I pulled this from the same piece I did regarding Brown v. Board. I went ahead and looked at every school, every LEA in Louisiana, and lined them up based on the 50 whitest schools and 50 blackest schools in our state, and then took a look at some of the varying characteristics of those schools, and basically the experiences that I wanted to see what the experience a white child in a predominantly white school looked like, and what a black child in a predominantly black school looked like in our state, and what were the disparities. So as you can see, the economically disadvantaged percentage of students was significantly different. Student performance scores, which, we can talk a lot about scores and the politics of that and what they're actually testing for. There were drastic differences in that. Some of the most concerning things for me, though, were that our teacher retention rates, certified teachers teaching in their field of study, those two statistics had drastic differences. Our Black students are going to schools on average that have much lower teacher retention rates, which could be due to funding not allowing their teachers to make a living wage. In places like St. Helena Parish, starting teacher salaries are around $30,000, I believe. And also,
these wonder why they don't stay.
It's shocking. And then our teachers these students are also attending schools where certified teachers are not really teaching in their field, or they have uncertified teachers that are teaching in their classroom or teaching multiple subjects. And that statistic could be drastically different as well, because many of our Blackest schools are also charter schools, typically in New Orleans and East Baton Rouge Parish. And charter schools do not have to report the percentage of certified teachers teaching in their field to the state. So, and then overall, school statistics are also drastically different. So this is showing where, funding and race are heavily connected, and the outcomes for students and the environments that we're sending our students to are drastically different because of it too. We can skim the next slide. You can do a quick. This is basically just every school district, every public school district, not charter, and the average and median teacher salary. The highest is Red River Parish, and the lowest, I believe, is Tensas and St. Helena on both levels.
And this is where I know this because I looked this up for another brief I wrote. And to give some people some scale, particularly some of y'all might remember the conversations around teacher pay raises last year with the governor and the legislature. We are at about $2,000 below the regional average. When you look at the average teacher salaries in Louisiana, we're at about $2,000 below the regional average, and we're about $10,000 below the national average. So when we talk about teacher retention and the issues that we have in the state around attracting and retaining our best teachers, and folks tell you, well, the teachers just got a raise. Just remember where we're starting from. I think conversations in our state about funding and about the way we fund things need to always include how much money are the feds paying for this, and also need to include where do we start? Because that's a thing that I saw happen a lot in our conversations in the legislature is even before COVID hit, the governor had planned another round of teacher raises, and there are some in the legislature that are like, we just did that. I was like, well, we just did that and we're still below everyone. So we need to keep doing it.
Mm-hmm. We did that, and then Georgia did more, and then Texas did more, and we were still falling behind. To provide context too, I was home for a wedding this past weekend. One of my childhood best friends got married, and I was talking to another family friend at the reception. His wife is a retired teacher. I grew up with the whole family. His wife was never an administrator. Maybe she was like a grade lead or something. Retired from a middle school a few years ago after 35 years of teaching, making $125,000.
Wow.
Superintendents don't make that here in some districts, so it's, tax dollars at work. This is another graph that I think is very much important. We don't have school support data at the district level in Louisiana. Sounds like a good idea for a resolution, but we do have Bureau of Labor Statistics data on regional wages for school support staff. So right here, you can see the bar basically shows the different thresholds of poverty. So household of 1, household of 2, household of 3, household of 4. And then I have arrows that point in where certain school support staff members are making based on Bureau of Labor Statistics. So the average school bus driver makes just over $20,000, meaning if they are a household of 4, basically almost a household of 3, they're just above it. They technically live in poverty if that's who they're supporting. And then an average teacher assistant is in poverty supporting a household of 3. And at the very top, you're going to find the Alice population it's actually a little bit higher now. They released a new report this year. Alice stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. The United Way puts out a report that basically quantifies how much money a family of four needs to survive in the state of Louisiana, and it's over $50,000. So the poverty.
For anyone who wants to look that up, it's called the Alice report. It's a really, really good report.
Yep. Okay, next slide. Very quick too. This I think is important because we know that teacher pay raises are raises for women. Louisiana has some of the biggest gender pay gaps, the biggest gender pay gap, number one in the country, unless the census data next week says differently, but we are number one right now. Women make 68 cents for every dollar earned by a man. That gets worse if you're a woman of color. And our teaching corps is predominantly women, and it's predominantly white women, but Black women are mildly overrepresented as well. Black women make up 18% of the teaching corps in Louisiana, and they make up about 15-ish%, I think, of the total population. So, okay, so how do we fix education? We're gonna make this really short.
So what do we need to do?
You're good. Yeah. Demand the MFE increase for inflation again. Inflation again. There should be an A there. Stagnant state funding for our public schools contributes to school segregation. It widens achievement gaps. It puts lower income districts at a financial disadvantage when they can't tap into the local revenue themselves, and it makes teacher pay uncompetitive. In my teacher pay report I did a few years ago, I looked at what a chemistry education degree at LSU and a chemical engineering degree at LSU looked like in terms of the pathways. It's like a semester and a half, maybe. It's like a year and some change different course load. 1 year of your college career could make you, $45,000 or $115,000 based on what path based on like what 2 semesters of classes look like. Yeah. So teachers need to make a lot more, especially in the sciences, if we're going to compete with the oil and gas industry in Louisiana. Okay.
And I think I want to add one thing there is that, like, for the educators who's watching this, a conversation you hear constantly is about everything that we're doing in our education system is building towards giving our students and our kids access to high wage, high growth jobs. And think about the reality that, like, teaching isn't on that list. And you can't in good conscience look at a child who's just spent 17 years in our education system is considering where to go for college. And we all know, and we have all learned in the last 20 plus years, what the potential risks of going to college and loans, et cetera, create around debt. I can't with good conscience look a kid in the eye who's come out of our education system and say, go to school for education. That's a high wage, high growth job. I can't do that. And we have to change that. If we want better schools, we have to change that.
I think one of the biggest, mishaps in Louisiana too, it's not necessarily where they start in many districts, it's where you end up 30 years later. The growth between your first year and your 30th year is maybe, 10, 15 grand. While back where I'm from, the growth between your first year and your 30th year is 50 grand. So,
yeah,
I'll keep fighting for it. I'll keep fighting for it. Okay. So, I want to pay for a lot of things in Louisiana. So, but I feel like, we shouldn't propose policy and budget changes unless we're going to say how we pay for it. Because I work for the Louisiana Budget Project and I'm a tax analyst first and foremost. So I'm going to give you 2 ways right now that you can yell at your legislators about. So the first is we need to eliminate the federal income tax deduction. Louisiana is one of a handful of states that still has this tax deduction on the books. It's terrible tax policy. People on the right hate it because it attaches our state taxes to our federal taxes and can make things unpredictable when forecasting revenue. And the left hates it because it mostly benefits wealthy people. So the way it works is if you itemize your taxes, if you don't take a standard deduction, you can deduct your federal taxes off of your income. So your federal taxes paid, you can deduct them off your income when you pay your state taxes in Louisiana. It costs the state of Louisiana $900 million a year. And no other state besides like 3 other people have, I think Alabama is one of them. Like we don't want to that's like the easiest way to get legislators in Louisiana to change something. Yeah, Alabama and Iowa are the only ones that have it uncapped. It's terrible tax policy. We could raise $900 million for schools and so many other programs through this, through getting rid of this deduction. It would be just a simple change of the law. Another one that
a lot of things we can do with 900 million.
A lot of things. Yep. Yeah. Yep. A millionaire
annually. Think about that, y'all. Annually.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, just to give again, to give scale, because I think it really always helps to give people scale. I don't know what the most updated number. You would actually probably be the person to tell me this, Neva. But the last report I saw showed that the revenue forecast for next year was decreased by about $900 million. So there you go. We could basically make up if we were doing this, we can make up our COVID losses as a state from the estimated decrease in sales tax revenue by just getting rid of this tax exemption that benefits the top 5% of our state.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And to be fair, I don't know how much it would technically cost us post-COVID based on what people's incomes look like this year, but it would still be a substantial amount of money. And another one I always throw out there for people, because I think it makes perfect sense, is a millionaire's tax bracket. Our current top rate is 6%. If you're an individual, you pay that on income over $50,000. So your 50,000th and $1 is taxed the same amount as somebody's $1 millionth dollar, and that's ridiculous. So I think we should do another top rate, just another 2%, right? People already pay 6% on that millionth dollar right now. If we change that to 8%, it would raise tax income over $1 million at 8%. It would be $40 million in income tax revenue for Louisiana, which was the teacher pay raise last year. It's $39 million. So, and like Kenny said, that's recurring revenue. I also have, y'all, I got a CVS receipt list of like
I'm sure you do.
I could do to raise revenue in the state. I keep like a running list of bill ideas, and I think it's important. And I think more people should get into the conversation around tax and budget. The one thing I always say about the Louisiana Budget Project is that a lot of advocates are fighting over this, the same pie right now. Like you've got higher ed. Yeah. Last year, the perfect example, it was higher ed, early childhood, and K-12, like neck and neck over money. We all need it. Yeah. And so, but we don't have to fight over it. We can raise it. We can raise it equitably too. Because
I would like to remind folks that on the other side of things, when we're talking about tax cuts, it's never or, it's always and. Mm-hmm. It's always, let's give a tax cut to the oil and gas industry and real estate developers and new business development. It's never or. It's never or on that side of things. Mm-hmm. It's always and when it's talking about giving resources to people.
We expanded $20 million in tax cuts to business this special session, in a 1-month session, without blinking an eye. Some of the programs we expanded had returns on investment that I would never bet money on to save my life. The Quality Jobs program, I think, gets about a 10-cent return on the dollar. And we expanded it this year. So, and let more industries apply for the program. So,
well, that sounds evidence-based and based in good economic principles.
Yeah. I don't know what world I'm living in. So that is the end of the presentation, y'all. That's my contact info and Twitter handle and all that good stuff. And now I'll be happy to take questions if y'all got time.
I have learned so much from you, Neva. I want to start by saying thank you so much for giving us now an hour and 20 minutes of your time. I always love talking with you. I love getting to work with you and everybody else at the Budget Project in our day jobs.
No, feeling
there's 2 questions that I didn't get to as we were talking that I think would be good to get into before I let you go. Mm-hmm. So I think this question is referring, I'm going to try to bring up the slide I was referring to. It's referring to the slide where you explained that you can only get economic disadvantage weight or EOL.
Go down a few.
Down a few. This one?
Next one, I think. Oh, I mean, that one. Yep.
This one. Okay. So you explained that it's or. You can get economically disadvantaged weight or English language learner weight. This question asks, Is it an either or wait for special education services and gifted and talented?
No.
Or is it both?
You could ostensibly receive both of those weights. Yep.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second question, which is an interesting one, which I don't know. I'm curious your answer is, what is the impact of ITEP? If you don't know what ITEP stands for, it's the industrial tax exemptions on school funding.
Yeah, that's a great question. I could do a full hour-and-a-half presentation on just that too. So I'll try to make it. I'll try to make it quick. If you are interested in ITEP, I am sure you are potentially connected with Together Baton Rouge and Together Louisiana. If you're not, definitely follow their work because they are the they've done fantastic work on the ITEP program. So essentially, what the ITEP program does is it allows business and industry to apply for property tax exemptions at the local level. And before John Bell made an executive order, a non-elected state board got to, check off those applications and take money away from local school boards without school boards having a say as to whether or not they needed those property tax revenues that they were rightfully owed. So what that's done is it's blown holes in the budgets of our local school districts, particularly the ones that have business and industry revenue that they can tap into. And the interesting part of it to me that is kind of the paradox is that if we say that these ITEP programs are going to bring in, good jobs and high paying individuals and whatever, well, if we want those people to move here and send their kids to our, world-class public school system, then we need those property taxes. Yeah. We need those property taxes to fund our schools. And what happens when those business and industry aren't paying their fair share, our property taxes are not insanely high here. When they're not paying their fair share, the burden gets placed on me and you and other people who are, trying to buy a home while also managing $100,000 in student debt after your master's degree. Like it's all about all of us pulling the weight to ensure that our community has the resources that we need to thrive and to grow and to, give our children the education that I feel they are rightfully owed. And yeah, part of that is if you're going to do business here, we all have to contribute. You're going to benefit from the workforce when they all graduate from a great school system. So, and that's not saying that an incentive can never be approved, right? Like, so incentives have places here and there, but I think a lot of critics feel that many of the ITEP applications are projects, and research has also shown that some of the projects are projects that have been approved for tax exemptions after they've been completed, like they were going to happen anyways, and then we gave them a tax break on it, and that's frustrated a lot of people as well.
Yeah, and I think a recurring theme we see in our conversations around the way things are funded, specifically taxes in the state, is imagine what our state budget and our tax policy would look like if we gave the same scrutiny to tax exemptions and tax breaks that we do to the way that we give out funding for social programs.
I say that all the time.
We love to means test how we take care of people, but we don't really means test giving away our tax dollars for free. Not to mention the fact that means tested was proven a long time ago to not be an effective way to govern. Mm-hmm. But that's a separate soliloquy that I could do. Yeah. Neva, thank you so much for your time. This was really, really great. I would love to have you back with us at Indivisible to have a future conversation about schools. Like Neva said, on the screen, you can see her contact information. I would highly recommend subscribing to the Daily Dime for so many reasons. I subscribe to it. I learned so much reading through the information that the Budget Project and that Neva puts out. But specifically, since looking forward, next year is a taxing session. So our state legislature will be looking into our taxes. And so some of these things that Neva has talked about can be changed next year. And so subscribe to the Daily Dime. Neva and the Budget Project will be working on it. And you can learn how to get involved. I'm really glad that we got to have this conversation. Before I go, I want to remind folks that we have 2 more of these happening this week. Tomorrow at the same time, 7:30, we'll be talking with Amy Grainer, who is one of the former top administrators for One App, our common enrollment system here in New Orleans. And so she'll be with me tomorrow to talk about One App, starting from what it is and how it works and answering your questions. And then on Thursday, also at 7:30, I will have Angel Delarge, who's from the Louisiana Public Association of Charter Schools, who's going to explain to us our unique system of governance in New Orleans and how we manage charter schools and how they're overseen and where the power lies. And like I said, the goal of all of these conversations is you're going to start to see school board forums and conversations pop up as we get closer to election day. And our goal at Indivisible NOLA is always to help educate y'all and give you the information you need to make informed decisions. And so our goal for these 3 conversations we're having is, as you go into those forums and the forums that we're going to have ourselves, you have information to really ask some real targeted questions of your prospective school board members and how they're going to advocate for our community and serve our community. So thank you guys for joining. If you tuned in late, you can catch this recording on our YouTube page. Thanks, guys, for joining us. See you guys tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Kenny. Thanks, y'all.